There was a room in the old farm that had been locked for 76 years. No one in the Whitaker family knew what was inside it. The neighbors said it was probably just an abandoned storage room. The bank had never bothered to value it, the county records did not mention it, and Harold Whitaker's children never once thought to ask why their grandfather had kept that door locked since 1948. But before that door ever opened, Harold Whitaker lost everything. On a cold Tuesday morning in Mason County, Kentucky, Harold's children took his house, his truck, and every dollar he and his wife had saved for 43 years. Then they gave him the only thing they believed had no value: an abandoned hill farm with a leaking roof, $9,800 in back taxes, a collapsed barn, a dry well, and a driveway so choked with weeds that even the mailman had stopped going up there. Harold sat at the end of the kitchen table, the same table where he had eaten breakfast with his wife June for nearly 30 years. Her chair beside him was still empty. June had been gone only 17 days. On the table in front of him were the papers for the house, the papers for the truck, the savings account documents, and brochures for a retirement home outside Lexington with smiling nurses on the cover. His son, Mark, slid the county tax notice across the table and gave a small laugh. "Dad, that place isn't an inheritance," he said. "It's a cleanup bill." His daughter, Denise, did not laugh. She was too busy arranging papers into neat stacks, the way she always did when she wanted something to look official. "The farm is still in your name," she said. "Grandpa left it to you personally. It was never added to the family trust. Mark and I don't want it. Nobody wants it." Harold looked at his two children. He saw the little boy who used to ride on his shoulders at the county fair. He saw the little girl who used to fall asleep in his lap while he worked on invoices at the kitchen table. And now he saw two grown adults who had learned how to take everything from an old man and call it responsibility. He did not yell. He did not beg. He only asked one question: "What's left?" That was when Mark pushed the old farm papers toward him. "Whitaker Ridge," Mark said. "Grandpa's place. Take it if you want, but don't say we didn't warn you." Denise folded her hands. "It has no real value, Dad. It needs repairs, it owes taxes, and the county could auction it any time now. Honestly, it might be better if you just let it go." Harold lowered his eyes to the paper. Whitaker Ridge Farm, 118 acres of rocky Kentucky hill ground, rough pasture, cedar trees, 2 dry creek beds, and a barn no one had opened since 1948. His father had never sold it. Not when the bank wanted it. Not when the highwaymen wanted to cut through it. Not when neighbors said the soil was too thin and the ridge could not raise anything but crows and coyotes. Harold reached into the pocket of his old wool coat and touched the brass pocket watch his father had left him. On the back were 4 engraved numbers: 1948. He had carried that watch for 22 years without knowing why those numbers mattered. He would know soon enough. But first, he had to get back to the farm. Harold Whitaker was 72 years old, but in Mason County, old men were not measured by their birthdays. They were measured by what they could still fix. And Harold could fix almost anything. For 40 years, he had run Whitaker Small Engine and Tractor Repair on the edge of Dawson, Kentucky. Dawson was the kind of town with 1 feed store, 1 diner, 2 churches, a post office, and a bank that had foreclosed on more family farms than anyone liked to remember. Harold was not rich. He had never owned a shiny sign, never bought newspaper ads, and never charged enough for his labor. Farmers brought him sick lawn mowers, old Ford tractors, broken hay rakes, cracked pumps, and engines that dealerships said were not worth saving. Harold saved them anyway. He had a way of listening to machines. He could hear a bad bearing before it failed. He could smell old gas in a carburetor from 6 feet away. He could tell when a tractor had been run too hard, just by the way the owner avoided looking him in the eye when he dropped it off. But Harold had left the hill farm behind when he married June. His father, Samuel Whitaker, had stayed there alone. Samuel was a quiet man with thick hands, a narrow face, and eyes that always seemed to be looking past the hill in front of him. He never trusted banks, never liked land agents, and never believed a man should sell ground just because someone wearing a tie called it useless. When Harold was young, he once asked his father why he kept the ridge. The farm did not grow corn worth bragging about. The pasture was rough. The upper field was full of limestone. The old house creaked in the wind. Every neighbor had better roads, better soil, and better fences. Samuel had only said one thing: bad soil can fool a banker. Good land knows how to hide. Harold did not understand it then. As he grew older, he thought maybe it was just something old farmers said to comfort themselves. Then June got sick. Then the repair shop closed. Then the papers started coming. And then Harold realized his father had not only been talking about soil, he had been talking about patience. The family meeting happened 17 days after June's funeral. Mark called it a family meeting because that sounded kinder than what it really was. Harold drove his blue 1998 Ford pickup to Mark's house. It was the same truck he had used for repair calls, hay bales, church suppers, and taking June to doctor appointments in Lexington. It had a dented tailgate, a cracked mirror, and 241,000 miles on the odometer. Mark lived in a brick house on a clean subdivision road outside town. Harold had helped him buy it years earlier. At the dining room table, Denise had a folder. Mark had a yellow legal pad. Mark's wife stayed in the kitchen, pretending not to listen. "Dad," Mark said, "we've been reviewing everything." Harold looked at the papers and knew right then that his children had been reviewing more than everything. They had been planning. Denise explained that the bank accounts had been moved because Harold was grieving and vulnerable. Mark explained that the house was legally his because Harold had signed the deed transfer years earlier when June first got sick. Denise explained that truck insurance would be too expensive if Harold kept driving. Mark explained that the tools from the repair shop had already been appraised. Every sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they formed a cage. Harold sat quietly through all of it. His hands rested on the table. His wedding ring felt loose on his finger because he had lost weight during June's sickness. "You are not throwing me out," he finally said. Mark sighed like a man trying to be patient with a child. "Nobody is throwing you out, Dad. We're transitioning you." "Transitioning me where?" Denise slid the retirement home brochure toward him. "Blue Meadow Living has openings. It's clean. It's safe. They have meals, laundry, transportation. I still cook." "You barely eat," Denise said. "I still drive." "You shouldn't," Mark said. "I still have money." Denise looked at Mark. That was the moment Harold understood. Not all of it, not every detail, but enough. He understood that the money was no longer within his reach. He understood that the house he had paid for no longer belonged to him. He understood that the truck outside, with his toolbox still in the bed, was about to become someone else's property. And he understood that his children had mistaken his silence for helplessness. "What about Whitaker Ridge?" Harold asked. Mark frowned. "What about it? My father left me that farm." Denise gave a short breath through her nose. "Dad, that place is a mess. It's mine." "Yes," Mark said. "Technically. Then I'll take it." Mark blinked. Denise stared. For the first time all morning, neither of them had a prepared answer. Mark laughed first. "Dad, there's no water, no working heat, no income, and almost $10,000 in back taxes. What are you going to do out there?" Harold stood slowly. "I guess I'll find out." 3 days later, Harold packed one suitcase. He took 2 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts, June's Bible, his father's pocket watch, an old ledger, and the small red toolbox he had owned since 1967. Mark kept the truck. Denise kept the checkbook. The house stayed behind with June's curtains still hanging in the front room. Harold rode a Greyhound as far as Dawson, then got off at the gas station near County Road 9. The clerk was a young man with earbuds in and no idea who Harold was. "You need somebody to pick you up?" the clerk asked. Harold shook his head. "I know the road." "You sure? Whitaker Ridge is a ways out. I walked it before you were born." The young man shrugged. Harold carried his suitcase in one hand and the red toolbox in the other. The road stretched east through cattle fields, cedar breaks, and brown late winter hills. After 2 miles, a woman in an old Dodge slowed beside him. "You Harold Whitaker?" He turned. She pushed up the brim of her feed cap. "I'm Earl Bennett's daughter. Daddy said somebody might come back to the ridge one day. Didn't think it'd be you." Harold gave a faint smile. "Neither did I." "You need a ride?" He looked down the road toward the ridge. "No, ma'am. I need the walk." By the time he reached the farm, his left knee had stiffened, and the handle of the suitcase had cut a red mark into his palm. Whitaker Ridge Farm sat at the end of a gravel drive that had nearly disappeared. The house was worse than he remembered. The porch sagged. The white paint had peeled down to grey wood. One upstairs window was broken. The chimney leaned a little. Cedars had grown too close to the east wall. Behind the house stood the barn. It had once been red. Now it was the color of old blood and weathered ash. The south end of the roof had collapsed inward. One sliding door hung crooked, but the smaller door on the backside was still shut tight with a black iron lock. Harold stood there for a long time. Something strange caught his eye. That black iron lock looked too solid compared with everything around it. The barn was rotting, the roof was broken, and the walls were grey with age, but the lock looked like someone had meant for it to last. Someone had either been inside, or someone had wanted to make sure no one else ever was. Harold set down his suitcase. "Well, Daddy," he whispered, "I came back." But he did not open that door that day. Harold believed some doors were better opened in daylight. That night would become one of the longest nights of his life. Harold slept in his father's old bedroom under 3 quilts that smelled of dust, cedar, and cold. There was no electricity, no running water, no heat except the fireplace, and the chimney smoked badly until Harold climbed onto the roof the next morning and cleared a bird nest from the flue. For 6 days, he worked from dawn until dark. He swept broken glass from the kitchen. He carried dead leaves out of the parlor. He patched the porch steps with boards pulled from a collapsed chicken shed. He found a hand pump near the old well, took it apart, cleaned the leather cup, greased the handle, and got muddy water to cough up from the pipe on the 3rd try. By the end of the week, he could make coffee. When the first hot sip touched his lips, Harold laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since June's funeral. He raised the cup like it was champagne. That was victory. On the 8th day, Earl Bennett drove over in a faded green pickup. Earl was 81, thin as a fence post, with a face like folded leather. He had farmed the lower valley all his life. He stepped out slowly and looked at the house, thought this place had finally won. Harold leaned on a rake. It almost did. Earl nodded toward the barn. "You opened that back room yet?" Harold looked at him. "You know about it?" Everybody knew Samuel kept it locked. Nobody knew what was in it. Not even you. Earl shook his head. "Your daddy was friendly, but he wasn't open." Harold smiled a little. "That sounds like him." Earl reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "Folks around here remember your father. He pulled my combine out of mud in '74 and wouldn't take a dime. Fixed Ruth Miller's furnace one Christmas. Lent seed to the Larkin boys when the bank cut them off. This ain't charity. It's old debt." Harold opened the envelope. Inside were $300 in 20s. His throat tightened. "I can't take this." "You already did," Earl said. "Don't make an old man argue in the cold." That money turned the lights back on. Not all of them. Only the kitchen, the downstairs bedroom, and one outlet in the hallway. But it was enough. The county water line did not reach the ridge. The old well would have to do. Harold bought beans, rice, nails, kerosene, and one small bag of clover seed from Dawson Feed and Seed. That was where Mark saw him. Dawson Feed and Seed had been standing since 1952, and every story in Mason County passed through it sooner or later. That morning, 6 farmers were drinking burnt coffee by the counter. Earl Bennett was there. So was Charlie Pike from the bank, wearing polished boots that had never seen manure. Mark stood near the seed rack, talking too loud. Harold entered with his old coat buttoned wrong and mud on his pant legs. The conversation went quiet. Then Mark smiled. "Dad?" Harold picked up a coil of wire and set it on the counter. Mark looked at the clover seed. "You planting a garden now?" "Pasture." A few men turned their heads. Mark laughed. "Pasture? On Whitaker Ridge?" Harold said nothing. Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to pretend he was being kind. "Dad, you don't even have a tractor. What are you going to do? Farm with a pocket watch?" That got a laugh. Not a cruel roar, just enough chuckles to make the room uncomfortable. Harold reached into his pocket and touched the brass watch. He felt the numbers engraved on the back. Then he laid $38 on the counter. The clerk, a young woman named Lila, looked embarrassed. "You want me to put the rest on account, Mr. Whitaker?" Before Harold could answer, Mark said, "Better not. That ridge already owes enough." The room went still. Harold looked at his son. For 1 second, the old man's face changed. Not anger, not hurt, something quieter, something that made Earl Bennett stop stirring his coffee. Then Harold said, "I'll pay cash." He counted out the bills. He picked up the clover seed, the wire, and the nails. And he walked out without raising his voice. Earl watched him go. Then he looked at Mark and said, "Boy, there are some things a man ought not laugh at." Mark rolled his eyes. "Come on, Earl. It's just an old farm." Earl looked out the window toward the ridge. "No," he said. "That's where you're wrong." That evening, Harold sat at the kitchen table with his father's pocket watch under a yellow bulb. The watch had not run in years. The brass was dull. The hinge was worn. On the back, the engraved numbers were still clear. 1948. Harold had always assumed it was a date. Maybe the year the watch was bought. Maybe the year his father paid off the farm. Maybe the year something happened that Samuel never told him. He turned the watch over in his palm. Then he noticed something he had missed for 22 years. The back plate was thicker than it should have been. Harold took a small screwdriver from his red toolbox and worked gently around the edge. The cover did not pop off at first. He almost stopped, afraid he would break it. Then it gave. Inside was a narrow, hollow space, and in that space was a tiny brass key, wrapped in oil paper. With it was a strip torn from an old feed sack. Samuel's handwriting. Floorboard under the south wall. Harold read it twice. Then he looked out the window at the barn. The same barn his father had watched from his chair. The same barn nobody had opened since 1948. He waited until morning. Not because he was afraid. Because some doors, Harold believed, should be opened in daylight. But sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning came grey and cold. Harold carried a lantern, a pry bar, and the brass key to the barn. The main sliding door fought him. Rust had frozen the track, and mud had packed under the bottom edge. He worked it loose inch by inch until it groaned open. Inside, the barn smelled of dust, dry hay, old oil, and raccoon droppings. Light came through cracks in the walls. The loft sagged. A broken hay rake leaned in one corner. An old harness hung from a peg like the ghost of a mule. At the back, behind a stack of rotten boards, stood the smaller door. The lock was black iron, heavy and cold. Harold put the key in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then it turned. The sound was small, but in that barn it felt louder than thunder. The door opened into a room no bigger than a pantry. There was no gold, no hidden cash, no treasure chest. Only a workbench, 2 shelves, a rolled map, a metal deed box, a coffee can full of nails, and a small red tractor under a canvas tarp. Harold pulled the tarp back. A Farmhouse cub. Faded red paint, flat tires, a cracked steering wheel, but complete, untouched, preserved better than anything else on the farm. On the workbench sat a ledger with Samuel Whitaker's name on the inside cover. Harold opened it. The first page read, "Whitaker Ridge Water Notes, 1948. Below that were dates, rainfall records, measurements from the spring, names of neighboring farms, and hand-drawn lines showing where water ran underground after heavy rain. Harold turned more pages. There were tax receipts, a notarized deed, an agreement with Mason County, a map showing a road that no longer appeared on modern county maps, and one sentence written in pencil on the back of an envelope. "They'll come for the ridge when they finally figure out what sits behind it." Harold sat on an overturned crate. He did not yet understand everything, but he understood one thing. His father had not hidden money. He had hidden proof. 2 days later, Harold carried the deed box to the Mason County Courthouse. The courthouse sat on Main Street, with stone steps worn smooth by generations of boots. Harold had not been inside since June renewed her driver's license years earlier. At the records office, an older woman with silver hair looked up from a computer. "Can I help you?" Harold removed his cap. "I hope so. I'm looking for old land records on Whitaker Ridge." The woman leaned forward. "Whitaker Ridge?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied his face. "Are you Samuel Whitaker's boy?" Harold blinked. "I am." The woman smiled softly. "I'm Ruth Ann Miller. Your father fixed my mother's furnace on Christmas Eve, 1969. Wouldn't take payment. Mama talked about that for the rest of her life." Harold placed the old documents on the counter. "I found these in his barn." Ruth Ann put on her glasses. She began with polite interest. Then she stopped speaking. She read the deed, then the easement, then the water agreement. Then she read the map. Her expression changed. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "do you know what you have here?" "No, ma'am, not exactly." She lowered her voice. "Your father didn't just keep the farm, he kept the road." Harold frowned. "The road." Ruth turned the map toward him. "See this? Old County Spur 14. It was abandoned on the surface, but the easement was never legally vacated. It crosses Whitaker Ridge and leads to the back acreage beyond your property." "The timberland? It used to be timberland," Ruth said. "Not anymore." She pulled up a recent filing. "A solar development company has been acquiring options back there, nearly 600 acres, but the only practical access for heavy equipment is over your ridge." Harold looked at the old map. Ruth tapped another page. "And this water agreement from 1948 gives your farm protected rights over the spring system feeding the lower valley. Nobody can alter drainage, drill, grade, or redirect water on that ridge without dealing with the owner." Harold was silent. Ruth looked at him carefully. "Has anyone tried to get you to sign anything?" Harold thought of Mark. "Yes." "Then don't sign a thing." A week later, the county mailed Harold a final notice. Back taxes, $9,800. Deadline, 30 days. If unpaid, Whitaker Ridge Farm would be listed for tax auction. Mark found out before Harold told him. That was how small counties worked. Nothing stayed private if enough people wanted to know. Mark drove up to the ridge in a leased SUV that looked foolish on a gravel road. Denise came with him. Harold was repairing a section of fence when they arrived. He had split cedar posts with Earl that morning and was tying wire by hand because he could not afford new stretchers. Mark stepped out in clean shoes and looked around like the place offended him. "Dad, this has gone far enough." Harold kept working. Denise hugged her coat around herself. "You can't live like this." "I'm living. You're 72. I was 71 last year, and nobody minded." Mark exhaled sharply. "The county is going to auction this place. You understand that, right?" "I understand. You don't have $10,000. "No. Then sign it over. I can deal with the taxes, maybe sell the timber, maybe get something out of it before the county takes it." Harold wrapped wire around a post. "You didn't want it. I don't want you losing everything." Harold looked at him. "You already helped with that." Denise's face tightened. "That's unfair." "No," Harold said quietly. "It's accurate." Mark stepped closer. "Dad, listen to me. There are developers looking at land around here. This could get complicated. You don't know how to handle that." Harold pulled the wire tight. "My father handled it before I was born." Mark frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not signing." For the first time, Mark's kindness mask slipped. "You are going to lose this farm out of stubbornness." Harold picked up his hammer. "No, son. I might lose it because I trusted the wrong people. But I won't lose it because I forgot who left it to me." Harold did not find a suitcase full of cash. No one handed him a miracle. He paid the taxes the way old farmers survived hard seasons, a little at a time. First, he fixed Earl Bennett's Ford 8N. Earl paid him $800 and a side of beef. Then he repaired a haybine for the Larkin brothers. They paid him $1,200 in cash and delivered 2 loads of gravel for the driveway. He cleaned the carburetor on a church mower, replaced a cracked pump on a neighbor's well, welded a gate for a cattleman south of town, and rebuilt the starter on an old Massey Ferguson that the dealership had refused to touch. Word spread. The old man on Whitaker Ridge was fixing things again. People drove up the ridge road with broken machines in truck beds and guilt in their eyes. Some remembered Samuel. Some remembered Harold. Some simply needed help and could not afford dealership prices. Harold kept a notebook. Every dollar in, every dollar out. At night, he worked on the Farmhouse cub in the barn. He cleaned the fuel tank, replaced the plugs, freed the clutch, patched a tire, filed the points, changed the oil, which came out black and thick as molasses. On the 23rd night, the little tractor started. It did not roar. It coughed, spat, shook, and then settled into a steady idle that filled the barn like an old hymn. Harold stood beside it with one hand on the hood. For a moment, he felt his father there, not as a ghost, as a standard. 3 days before the tax deadline, a collector from Ohio offered Harold $5,000 for the Farmhouse cub. Harold almost refused. Then he looked at the tax notice. He sold the tractor, but kept a photograph, the serial plate rubbing, and the old ledger that had been stored beneath the seat. By the morning of the deadline, Harold had $9,842. He put it in a paper envelope. Then he walked into the Mason County tax office. Mark was already there. So was Charlie Pike from the bank. Mark had come to watch the farm fall. Harold stepped to the counter and laid down the envelope. Ruth Ann Miller was standing near the record's door. She did not smile, but her eyes did. The clerk counted the money, then stamped the paper. Paid. The sound of that stamp went through the room like a rifle crack. Mark stared. Charlie Pike looked down at his shoes. Harold folded the receipt and put it in his coat pocket beside the brass watch. Then he turned to leave. Mark caught his arm. "Where did you get that money?" Harold looked at his son's hand until Mark let go. "From work," he said. "The solar company sent 3 representatives to Mason County 2 weeks later. One wore a navy suit. One wore work boots too clean to be believed. One carried maps in a plastic tube. They met in the courthouse conference room with the county attorney, Charlie Pike, from the bank, Mark, Denise, and Harold. Mark had inserted himself into the meeting by claiming he was helping manage his father's affairs. Harold let him sit there. Sometimes silence was the best trap. The company wanted access to the 600 acres behind Whitaker Ridge. They had contracts with the owners. They had financing. They had surveyors ready. They only needed a road. The man in the navy suit pointed to a modern map. "This old path across Mr. Whitaker's land appears to be the most efficient route. We're prepared to offer a one-time access payment." Mark leaned forward. "How much?" The man looked at Harold. "That depends on final survey." Mark spoke before Harold could. "My father is elderly. I can help negotiate." Harold took the deed box from under his chair and set it on the table. "No," he said. "You can listen." Ruth Ann Miller entered with copies of the old records. The county attorney adjusted his glasses. The first document was the 1948 easement. The second was the county road abandonment record. The third was the water rights agreement. The fourth was Samuel Whitaker's hand-drawn spring map, later matched with county survey notes. The room changed slowly. At first, the men from Lexington looked politely bored. Then they looked interested. Then careful. Then concerned. Charlie Pike's fingers stopped tapping on the table. The smile on Mark's face faded. Denise whispered, "What is that?" Ruth Ann answered, before Harold did. "That," she said, "is the reason Samuel Whitaker never sold the ridge." The county attorney cleared his throat. "It appears Mr. Whitaker controls the only historically recorded access corridor suitable for development traffic." The solar company's engineer looked at his map. "And the spring system?" "Protected," Ruth said. "No grading that disrupts flow without written consent from the landowner." The room went quiet. For nearly 20 years, Mark and Denise had thought the farm was worthless because nobody had offered to buy it. They had never asked why no one could build behind it. They had never checked the old county books. They had never opened the barn. They had taken the house. They had taken the truck. They had taken the savings. But they had forgotten the farm Samuel Whitaker never sold. And now everybody in the room knew why. Harold did not look at Mark or Denise then. He looked down at the pocket watch in his hand, as if he were speaking to his father. Charlie Pike was the kind of banker who smiled with his mouth and counted with his eyes. He had known Mark for years. He had heard the jokes about Harold living on the ridge. He had probably repeated a few himself. Now he held Samuel Whitaker's deed in both hands. He read it once, then again. Then he looked at Harold. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. Not Harold, not old man. Mr. Whitaker. That small change did not go unnoticed. Mark's face reddened. Denise sat very still. The man from the solar company folded his hands. "Mr. Whitaker, we may need to revise our offer." Harold nodded. "You will." Mark turned to him. "Dad, we should discuss this as a family." Harold looked across the table. "We did that already." Denise's voice lowered. "That is not fair." Harold's eyes moved to her. "No, fair would have been reading papers before asking your father to sign them. Fair would have been leaving June's curtains in her house until the ground settled over her grave. Fair would have been asking what that farm meant before calling it a cleanup bill." No one spoke. Harold did not raise his voice. That made it worse. The county attorney pushed the documents back toward him. You have leverage here, Mr. Whitaker. Harold placed his hand on the deed box. No, he said. I have responsibility. Harold did not sell the farm. That surprised everyone. The solar company offered enough money to make Mark lean back in his chair. Harold refused. They offered more. He refused again. Finally, he agreed to a lease, not a sale. The company could use the old access corridor under strict terms. They would improve the gravel road, but could not widen it past the old fence line. They would install proper drainage. They would protect the spring flow. They would bury no line across the pasture without approval. They would pay an annual access fee, adjusted every 5 years. They would also restore power to the farmhouse and repair the culvert at the lower crossing. The company's lawyer tried to soften the terms. Harold did not move. The man in the navy suit said, "Mr. Whitaker, you drive a hard bargain." Harold shook his head. "My father did. I'm just reading it." The agreement was signed 6 weeks later. By summer, gravel trucks were climbing Whitaker Ridge Road. By fall, the farmhouse had reliable power for the first time in decades. By winter, Harold had a new roof on the barn, clean water running from the well, and enough income from the access lease to pay taxes for the rest of his life. At Dawson Feed and Seed, the jokes stopped. Men who had laughed at the clover seed now asked Harold what he was planting next. He planted more clover, then orchard grass. Then he fenced 20 acres for grazing. The ridge did not become rich farmland overnight. It became what Samuel had always known it was, useful, if understood. Mark came back in March. He arrived alone. No Denise, no lawyer, no papers. Harold was repairing a gate near the barn. The ridge was greening in patches, and clover had begun to show in the lower field. Mark stepped out of his SUV and stood awkwardly, with his hands in his coat pockets. "Place looks better," he said. Harold kept tightening a hinge. "It does. I heard the company finished the road." "They did. I heard the lease is good." "It is." Mark nodded. For a while, the only sound was wind moving through the cedars. Then Mark said, "Dad, I made mistakes." Harold looked at him. Mark swallowed. "I thought I was helping at first. With the house, the accounts. After Mum got sick, everything felt like it was falling apart, and I thought if I controlled it, I could keep it from getting worse." "That why you took the truck?" Mark looked down. "No. That why you laughed at me in the feed store?" "No. That why you came to the courthouse to watch this place get auctioned?" Mark did not answer. Harold nodded once, as if silence had confirmed what words would only decorate. "I don't hate you, Mark." Mark's eyes lifted. "But I don't trust you." That hurt him more than anger would have. "I can make it right," Mark said. "Can you?" "I can put your name back on the house." Harold looked past him toward the ridge. "The house was where I lived with your mother, but it stopped being home when you turned it into paperwork." Mark flinched. Harold set down the wrench. "You want to make it right? Start with the truth. Tell Denise. Tell your wife. Tell your children. Tell them what you did without making yourself the hero of the apology." Mark's mouth tightened. "That's hard." Harold picked up the wrench again. "So is walking 4 miles with a suitcase." Denise took longer. She did not come to the farm until June. On what would have been her mother's birthday, she brought flowers. Not for Harold, for the small stone he had placed under an oak tree near the house, where he sometimes sat with June's Bible. Denise stood there for a long time. Harold watched from the porch but did not interrupt. When she finally approached, her face was pale. "I didn't think of it as stealing," she said. Harold nodded. "That's how most stealing gets done." She wiped at her eye. "I told myself we were protecting you." "From what?" "Bad decisions. Scammers. Loneliness. Yourself, I guess." "And who protected me from you?" Denise closed her eyes. The words landed, but Harold did not enjoy saying them. That was the strange thing about real vindication. It did not always taste sweet. Sometimes it tasted like ashes. "I'm sorry," Denise whispered. Harold sat in the porch chair his father used to sit in. "I believe you." She looked relieved. Then he added, "But sorry doesn't undo signatures." Denise sat on the porch step. "What happens now?" Harold looked across the field. "I made a new trust." She stiffened. "This farm stays whole for 30 years. It cannot be sold by my children. It cannot be borrowed against. It cannot be transferred to a developer. Income from the access lease pays taxes, repairs, and a county fund for small farmers behind on land tax. Denise stared at him. You gave it away? No, Harold said. I protected it. From us. He looked at her gently. From what you became when money was on the table. Denise covered her mouth. Harold did not reach for her right away. Then, after a moment, he did. Because he was still her father. But forgiveness, he had learned, did not require foolishness. By late summer, Whitaker Ridge looked different enough that people slowed their trucks when they passed. The driveway was clear. The barn roof was straight. The farmhouse had white paint on the front again. Clover covered the lower pasture in a green so deep it looked almost blue after rain. At the county fair that year, the Mason County Farm Bureau asked Harold to speak about preserving family land. He almost said no. He had never liked microphones. But Earl Bennett told him Samuel would have gone just to make the banker uncomfortable, so Harold went. The room was full of farmers, county officials, bankers, church people, old mechanics, young couples trying to hold on to inherited land, and men who had laughed at him in the feed store. Mark stood in the back. Denise sat near the side wall. Charlie Pike from the bank sat in the second row with his arms crossed. Harold walked to the front carrying no notes, only the brass pocket watch. He set it on the podium. My father gave me this watch, he began. For 22 years, I thought the number on the back was just a date. He held it up. 1948. The room was silent. That was the year he protected the water. The year he recorded the road. The year he decided not to sell land everyone else said was useless. He looked over the crowd. My children took my house, my truck, and my savings. That is true. A ripple moved through the room. Mark lowered his eyes. Harold continued. They left me the farm because they thought it was worthless. But I'm not telling you that to shame them. He paused. I'm telling you because a lot of people in this room have done the same thing in smaller ways. We sell what we don't understand. We laugh at what looks old. We trust papers we haven't read. We call land dead because it doesn't grow what we wanted. We call men useless because they move slower than they used to. No one moved. Harold picked up the watch. My father used to say bad soil can fool a banker. Good land knows how to hide. A few older farmers smiled. I think people are the same way. He looked toward Mark and Denise. Some value doesn't shine. Some value waits. Some value is locked in a barn until somebody patient enough comes back with the right key. The room stayed quiet. Then Earl Bennett began clapping. One clap, then another. Then the whole room stood. Charlie Pike did not stand at first. Then he did. Mark wiped his face with one hand. Denise cried openly. Harold did not smile like a man who had won. He only looked down at the watch and closed his fingers around it. Harold Whitaker lived on Whitaker Ridge for 9 more years. He never moved back into the house Mark had taken. Mark eventually sold it and used part of the money to repay what he had taken from the savings account. Harold accepted the check, then deposited it into the farm trust. Denise became the unpaid bookkeeper for the small farmer tax fund. Harold made her write every number by hand the first year. Computers are fine, he told her, but handwriting makes you feel the weight of a dollar. The fund helped 7 families keep their land in its first 5 years. Not big farms, not famous farms. 80 acres here, 40 acres there. A widow's pasture, a young couple's hayground, a retired mechanic's 2 barns and a pond. Harold did not become rich in the way Mark once understood richness. He became something harder to measure, necessary. Every spring he walked the ridge with a cane and checked the clover. He kept the old spring clear of leaves. He painted the barn door red. He sat on the porch in the evening, with June's Bible beside him and his father's watch in his pocket. When he died, the county church was full. Not because Harold had owned much, because he had kept what mattered. At the front of the church, beside the flowers, sat the brass pocket watch, and under it, on a small card, written in Denise's careful handwriting, were the words Harold had spoken the day Mark asked why he refused to sell. You took what had a price. You left what had a promise. After the funeral, Mark and Denise drove to Whitaker Ridge together. They stood at the barn their grandfather had locked in 1948. The new trust papers were already filed. The farm could not be sold. The road could not be exploited. The water could not be redirected. The land would remain whole. For the first time in their lives, neither of them had the power to turn it into money. And maybe that was Harold's final gift. He had stopped them from selling the one thing that might still teach them who they were. The ridge was quiet that afternoon. Wind moved through the cedars. Water ran under stone. Clover bent in the field. And the old farm, the one everyone had called worthless, kept doing what it had done for generations. It waited, it remembered, and it belonged to no one who did not understand the promise buried in its soil. Some people only see value when a banker writes it down. Some only believe land matters when a developer wants it. Some only respect an old man when the courthouse proves he was right. But Harold Whitaker's father knew better. He knew that land can hide its worth. He knew that paper can protect a promise. And he knew that a thing called worthless by greedy people may be the only thing still standing when everything with a price has been taken away. They took Harold's house. They took his truck. They took his savings. But they forgot the farm his father never sold. And in the end, that was the only thing they should have remembered.